It's that wonderful time of year again, so I want to share a story of something that happened to me several years ago. I try to share this frequently as a warning to not only women, but anyone that could be vulnerable in this situation. Some may take this story as entertainment, and I'm okay with that too. But I just hope that that means that they will remember it and be able to avoid something like this. So, here it goes. This was back in the winter of 2017, the end of November. I'm a very social and outgoing person, so when the holidays roll around, I'm always planning parties for my family, both sides. A party that my boyfriend and I would host for some of his family, as well as some parties with friends. I also love the gifting side of it. I love seeing people's reactions when they open a gift that I got them. So, every year, I try to make or get the perfect gift for everyone. This year I knew specifically what I wanted to get my sister, but unfortunately, it was a bit pricey. So, I'd been going to a few different places looking for the best price. I had even braved the Black Friday sales but had no luck. So, late one night, I wound up at a department store to pick up a gift for someone else, as well as some more wrapping paper. I also tried to get my shopping done and prepped as early as possible, so that I'm not running around last minute. It was late one night, and with no work the next day, I started by just casually roaming the aisles to see if there was anything else I wanted. I was looking at shoes when I saw an associate at the end of the aisle. I could tell that he worked there, because while he was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, he had his name badge hanging out of his pocket. So my thought was, he was probably AP. That's asset protection for those of you who don't know. I understand the purpose of the job, especially with the holiday season, but sometimes the associates take it too far, or they think they're so good at it that they're terrible at it, if that makes sense. And so, anyways, I spotted him looking at something on the end cap and continued doing what I was doing. But when I started trying on a pair of shoes, I texted my sister-in-law to get her shoe size, thinking that she would like the ones I was looking at. While waiting for her response, I felt that familiar sensation of being watched, and looked up at this guy, and of course, he went from looking at me to quickly looking back down at the fuzzy socks. So I rolled my eyes with a soft laugh, grabbed the shoes, and walked away. I walked around the store a little longer, but of course, Mr. AP was there every step of the way. I kept finding him at the end of the aisles, seemingly busy, but obviously watching me. It was late, I was tired, and was already kind of annoyed with being followed, so I just decided to go and grab the item I came for so I could leave. However, as I made my way to my destination in that store, I was shocked to see the item I'd been looking at for my sister, and it seemed to be about $15 cheaper. Even crazier in my opinion were that there were no sales tags on it. It was like this was the normal price, so I knew that I had to get it. The only thing preventing me from taking it up to the checkout counter was the anti-theft mechanism holding it on the shelf. So I had to find someone to help. I walked over to a nearby aisle but didn't see anybody, but I also didn't want to go far, calling dibs on the item on the shelf. Finally, I did spot an associate, but it was the AP guy. So, why not ask him for help, I guess, as well as get the satisfaction of calling him out to say, hey, yes, I see you and you're not sneaky. However, I called out to him saying, excuse me, sir, you work here, right? He did a double take at me, but then, without saying anything, he walked away with his head down. Now, I was no longer annoyed. I was pretty angry. I understand that AP is supposed to look undercover in a sense, but he obviously was not doing a good job. So, why not ask for help? He could have at least said, "I'll go get someone for you," or something like that. Instead, he just ignored me. I finally just gave up and started heading to the front of the store to leave, but I still wanted to share my experience with someone. So, once I got there, I told the cashier that I needed help with an item, and that the one associate that I saw ignored me and also mentioned that I was pretty sure it was their AP guy, too. And the cashier looked at me curiously and said that they would let management know, and even called for someone to get the item for me. Once I got my item, I paid for it all and started heading to the door, receipt in hand, preparing to be stopped one last time. To my surprise, though, I didn't see him at the door. But then my relief was quickly stomped out when I saw him standing by the bench outside the doors. Now, I was pretty pissed off. I waved my receipt in the air in his direction and said in an annoyed tone, "It's all paid for. You can leave me alone now." But he then answered that with an obvious smile in his voice and said, "You sure about that?" At that point, I instantly went from annoyed to scared. It was something about the way he said that instantly creeped me out. I continued walking to my car, but now backwards, not wanting to turn my back to this guy. I had my keys in my right hand, but I was now adjusting them to go in between my knuckles as I walked. And when I got to my car, there was a truck in front of me, so once I got to the door, I wouldn't be able to see him. I quickly jumped in, holding my 2 bags and my purse, trying to quickly move them out of the way so that I could lock my doors. Once locked, I looked around to see if the guy followed me, but he was nowhere in sight. After I calmed down, I told myself that I needed to report this to the store because this was never acceptable. If he really thought I was stealing something, he should have stopped me at the door, not followed me to my car. So, I called the store and I asked for a manager. As I explained to them what I had experienced, the woman asked me if I was still there, and I said that I was in my car. She asked if I would come back into the store to give them an official statement that they could file, and ask me a few more questions. I told her that I would be willing to, but that I also was not willing to get out of my car alone. So, she actually walked out to my car, and as we both walked in together, we looked around and did not see this guy. I went into the manager's office with her, and there was another male manager already in there. She had explained further about what all happened. I left the bags in the car, but had my purse, keys, receipt, and phone with me. She didn't even seem remotely concerned that I was stealing and asked me for a description of the guy. After I described him, she looked over at the other manager who made a face and shrugged. She then turned back to me and said that she was concerned because they didn't have anyone, AP or otherwise, working that night that matched the description. Yeah, cue me really panicking now. She even had their guy in AP come out, and I confirmed that it was not him. He'd actually been in the security room watching the cameras while I was there. Thankfully, they had the same idea that I did. They had me review a portion of the camera footage to point the guy out, and suggested that we file a police report because of what he was doing. It was my choice, since all they could really report was a suspicious person. But if they were willing to, then so was I. We waited for the police to show up, and once more explained what happened. Their real AP couldn't find him anywhere in the store, and couldn't find him outside, so they all assumed that he'd probably left, or at least walked to somewhere where the cameras couldn't find him. I, of course, was not feeling too good about going home alone now, so one of the officers was kind enough to walk me to my car and follow me home. He then said that they would drive around the area a few times before leaving. Thankfully, this all made me feel better about the situation, and that maybe this guy was just a creep whose plans were foiled. Or maybe he was even just screwing around and playing a very unfunny prank. Either way, I was glad it was over. Or, at least, I thought it was over. I went to bed just fine. After calling my boyfriend and telling him what happened, and even the next morning, I had pretty much put it in the back of my mind. But later that morning, after I had breakfast and a shower, I had to run some errands. I went out to my car and I was unlocking it, and I noticed a shape on my window. After looking at it from different angles because of the glare, I was able to confirm what I was seeing. There was an obvious cupped palm print on the glass, like somebody was looking into my car. I know that it wasn't there the previous day. It was pretty obvious as the handprint seemed to be oily or something, and it left a residue, which is why I noticed it and would have if it was there the day prior. All the bad feelings from the day prior came rushing back, and I ran inside and called my boyfriend. He told me to make a report with the police, which I did. Unfortunately, because I couldn't prove that it was related to the incident, or that I even knew who this person was, they couldn't really do much. So, I was left feeling vulnerable, helpless, and not to mention possibly watched or stalked. I ended up staying home that day, ordered cameras online, and waited till my boyfriend got off work to take me to the places I needed to go. I can report that I have not seen that guy since, thankfully, nor have I experienced anything similar to it. I don't know what his intentions were, but I do hope that he was just screwing around, and that I can call him a jerk. But it really did freak me out, and I was kind of afraid to go places alone for at least a few months. I've seen posts and horror stories about women being followed, and things being done to their cars to try and trick or distract them, and that caused quite a bit of fear in me. What if that was his goal? What if the print was a distraction? Or maybe just him making sure that he had the right car? It still freaks me out, but I try to put it to rest by instead thinking of all the right things that I did. I'm proud of myself for calling the store. I'm proud of myself for filing the police report for them, and even calling the cops the following morning, even if they said they couldn't do anything. And I'm proud that I didn't just ignore it, and that I kept myself safe. Today, I carry pepper spray and continue to keep an eye out for people around me. So, I guess, bottom line, don't ever think you're paranoid if you experience something unsettling, or something or someone makes you feel unsafe. Report it. Worst case scenario is that it's nothing, and you can put your fears to rest. Stay safe out there, folks. I used to work the late shift at a local gas station, the shift where all you get is regulars and random people passing through. We were just off an exit by a major freeway, so we would typically only get people that were just going into work early in the morning, or people that were driving through town and needed to stop for gas. It was a decent job. Most people were decent, and really there wasn't much to complain about. We had this one customer that would come in a few times a week named Tom. Tom was a nice dude, late 30s or early 40s, seemed kind-hearted and always had something he wanted to talk about. Or he would have a joke that he really wanted to tell. From what I knew about him, he was just a night owl, and he'd been in a few times, and he just kind of latched onto our station as a bit of a safe haven. A place to spend a few minutes away, socialize a bit, and then get on with his night. Over time, Tom and I had developed what most people would call a friendship, though it only ever existed at work for me. He started being a bit more open with some of the hardships in his life, and he'd certainly been through some tough times. It never felt like a sob story, though. He just seemed like he wanted to share who he was, and that was that. I appreciated it. We talked through some things. He gave me advice about my relationship based on his relationship with his ex-wife. That kind of thing. One of the topics that would always seem to knock his cheery demeanor down a notch, though, was his younger brother, Mark. Mark apparently struggled with addiction, as an on and off kind of thing. He'd been to rehab, he'd gotten clean, and then he relapsed within the same year. Something that had happened multiple times in the last decade. Despite this, Tom was dedicated to his little brother, and he had put in a lot of time and money to help him out, to the point that Mark was now living with him. From what I gathered, this was actually one of the reasons his marriage fell apart, because Tom was unwilling to let Mark die on the streets, and his wife basically told him it was her or Mark. Tom wasn't willing to give up, and he really believed that things would get better. One evening, I was sweeping up the floor and wiping down some of the station's surfaces, and when I heard the bell chime, I looked down at my watch and saw that it was about 3:30 in the morning, which typically meant it was going to be a regular over a traveler. I glance over, and I see Tom's head over the shelf. I shouted out, "Hey Tom, I'll be right up in a moment. Let me just finish wiping this down." He didn't say anything, so I quickly finished wiping down the soda fountain and made my way to the front, but immediately paused when I looked over at Tom. The first thing I noticed was that he looked like he'd been crying, and his eyes were wide in shock. The second thing I noticed was that his hands and shirt were covered in blood. I rushed over to him to ask him if he was okay, what had happened. He lifted his hands to stop me from approaching, and shook his head before just saying, "Call the cops. Please, just call the cops." I hesitated for a moment, not really sure what was going on, but after a few seconds of thinking it over, I just told him, "Okay," and walked behind the counter to call 911. When they answered, I told them that I had a customer that was requesting the police, and Tom broke down sobbing uncontrollably. He slumped down to the floor and just kept saying, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I didn't mean for this to happen." I was in shock, but just kept trying to relay what I was seeing to the dispatcher, and told her that I needed an officer there ASAP. It really was not something I would have expected to have to deal with. Tom was such a kind-hearted and gentle man, but the thought of him hurting someone, and to do so in a way that covered him in blood like that, it just seemed impossible. After the dispatcher disconnected, I tried to talk to him to ask him what had happened, trying to keep him calm and connected to the real world. He kept apologizing over and over, saying that he didn't mean to do it, that he didn't mean to get me involved, he just didn't know where else to go. I told him it was okay, that it would get figured out, and that I wasn't mad at him. He just stayed sitting on the floor with his knees curled up, crying his eyes out and apologizing. After a couple of moments, we heard the sirens, and that seemed to push him to a sobering point. He'd stopped crying, wiped his face on his sleeve, and cleared his throat as he watched the officers walk to the door. Obviously, they were as confused as I was, asking what exactly was going on. I guess the look on my face told them that I had no idea, as they turned their attention to Tom, sitting on the floor and covered in blood. And they asked him what had happened, and he stood up saying, "I'm not going to cause you any trouble. I'm not going to fight back. Please just arrest me." And the officer asked him why he needed to be arrested, and I will never forget the dark and painful tone he took on when he responded with, "I murdered my brother." The officer asked him a few more questions, just trying to clarify that he was saying what he thought he was saying, and he confirmed with them again, and again, that he had murdered his brother. After a bit of back and forth, They did lead him out of the store, and one of the officers came back to ask me some questions. All I could offer were the fragments of his life that I was aware of. That he lived with his brother Mark, that Mark was an addict and was a cause of a lot of stress for Tom. None of it really seemed helpful, other than to confirm that he did have a brother, and that the possibility was there. The rest of the shift after they left was eerily quiet, and I was mentally in a weird place. I found out a few days later that Tom had actually gotten into a very violent altercation with Mark. In a moment of desperation and confusion that was fueled by years of pent-up frustration, Tom had attacked Mark. He left him really, really messed up after attacking him, to the point that Tom thought he was dead. Mark actually did not die from the attack, but had come rather close to death. He was in the hospital and was going to need a lot of work and recovery time, but he was most likely going to live. The news hit me kind of hard. I was forced to think back on all the nights that I'd spent having aimless conversations with Tom, and how much he had wanted his brother to get better. It is terrifying to me to really think about how quickly and how sharply things can go from "I'm doing everything I can to help you get better" to attempted murder. And Tom was not a person that I would ever anticipate getting violent. In the end, I guess we all have our own demons, those voices inside our head that lead to those intrusive thoughts. And unfortunately for Tom, those demons won that night. I guess I just hope that that night was a turning point for both brothers, and that they both got the help they needed. Hey Raven, this may be a little different than what you normally do, but I still thought you would appreciate it. This happened Christmas Eve in 2018. I was living in Colorado at the time, in a small 2-bedroom house by myself. It was my first owned place, and I was enjoying my new home in a quieter neighborhood, outside of the bigger city life that I had left behind. My grandparents had their own piece of land, and I loved seeing them out there in the quiet, peaceful nights. It's actually what convinced me to move to the home that I have now. That night was going just as planned. I had the day off, as well as Christmas Day and the day after. My mom was to pick up my grandma from her home Christmas morning, and I was going to meet them back at my parents' place with my other siblings. And to make it even better, it had started snowing. It was going to turn out to be a perfect Christmas with everyone together and a beautiful blanket of snow on the ground. After watching TV and drinking one of my favorite hot chocolate bombs, I decided to call it a night, knowing that I was going to need to be up early to get my car cleaned off. I remember the details from here perfectly. I can't forget it. I went to bed around 10 p.m., and was abruptly woken to a phone call at 2:24 a.m. The number shown was listed as unknown, but knowing the time, I answered it to make sure it wasn't an emergency. But all I heard was a faint and almost inaudible whisper. I couldn't make out any of the words. I said hello a few more times, but the whispering continued, until the line just went dead. I was confused, if not a little annoyed. Who would prank call someone on Christmas Eve, right? I just laid back down and tried to go back to sleep, but my phone started going off again, from another unknown number. I answered the same way, and just like the last time, all that was there was the whispering. The annoyance was now overtaking the confusion that they were still calling me. I asked, "Who is this?" But the whispering only continued, and I was nowhere closer to being able to make out what was being said. And then once again, the call just ended. And this time I tried to see if I could call the number back, but it wouldn't. It was like a blocked number, so there was no way to call it or even block it. I was pretty awake at this point, but still tried to sleep, knowing that if I didn't, it was going to be a very long day. However, I once again received a call, and this time I answered with a bit more annoyance in my voice. "What do you want?" I said aggressively into the phone. Again, the whispering continued until I could make out one word. Marcus. It was my name. Because I could make that out, I tried to listen closer to the whispering to see if I could hear something else. Was someone in trouble? Were they calling me for help, but all they could do was whisper? I pushed the phone harder to my ear, plugging the other one with my finger, when out of nowhere the whispering was interrupted by a very loud train whistle. It actually made me jump. Pulling the phone away from my face, I continued to hear the train whistle for several more seconds, before it eventually faded, and the call ended again. Now, I was for sure awake, and I wasn't going to be able to fall back asleep. The train whistle was obviously unexpected. I didn't live near any train tracks, so I knew at least that the call wasn't coming from around my area, but then where? And again, who was it that was calling me? Like I said, it was 2-something in the morning. I was groggy, confused, and now startled. So I wasn't thinking straight and definitely was not going back to sleep. I went back to the living room thinking maybe I could watch some TV and doze off in there. But every little sound was making me jump. The creaks in the floor, the ice maker clicking on, and even the tapping on the window from my sun catcher outside. Thankfully, my phone didn't ring again, but damage was already done. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep in the living room at some point, because I woke up to the alarm on my phone at 6 a.m. I tried to snooze it some, but eventually I just got up. I was still feeling pretty tired and now had a little bit of a stiff neck, but I knew that I needed to get moving. I had taken a shower and then went out to start cleaning off my car. It was probably around 8 at this point when I got a call from my mother. Her voice was shaky, and she asked me where I was and what I was doing. I told her that I was about to head over to her place, but asked her what was wrong. I knew my mom, and I could tell that something was wrong. And her explanation forever changed our Christmas. She told me that she had gone to pick up my grandma, but she didn't answer the door, so she had to let herself in. Not really unusual, especially if my grandma didn't hear the door or was in the bathroom or something. We even installed a Ring doorbell so that she could be notified on her phone, but she also liked to sit her phone down somewhere and then forget about it. She was definitely not attached to her phone like us kids, as she would always tell us jokingly. But when my mom entered, she knew that something was wrong when the TV wasn't on and the coffee maker was empty. She called out to her and got no response, so she went to her room. My mom found my grandmother unresponsive, and after help arrived, they pronounced her. My mom already knew that she was gone. She didn't suffer and she wasn't hurt. She passed quietly and peacefully in her sleep that night. That's when I think I pieced things together. When we got her death certificate, I saw that the approximate time of death was around 2:30 a.m. Then I started thinking back to those calls that I got. Was that my grandma? She had a cell phone and I had her number saved, sure, so it should have showed up if she did call me physically. But maybe it wasn't that kind of call. I even proved that when we had her phone and I checked the records. There were no calls to me. I didn't really want to say it to anyone, but I did ask if my parents or siblings got any weird or prank calls that night. They all said no. So I got these strange calls of whispering, and my name being whispered at the same time of her death. Oh, and to add to it, she actually lived fairly close to a train yard. Train whistles were very common around her place, so I really felt like this was possible. Was she calling to let me know? Was that her last attempt to reach me and say goodbye? I still think about that night on a regular basis, especially around this time of year, and I hold on to it as a last connection that I had with my grandmother. She was always the type to play little pranks on us grandkids, even as we became adults, and I now recognize this as her way of one last hurrah before she left this place, and I smile when I think about it. I was definitely confused, and yeah, kind of annoyed at first, but now I feel lucky that I got the call. We make sure to keep up our normal Christmas traditions, as we know that's what she would have wanted, not for us to be sad or mournful. And I always smile when I hear a train whistle, too. The following events still come up and cause difficulties for me at times, even 6 years later. And I promise you that all of this was real. Sometime after high school, I moved out of state for a job opportunity. After some time, I was given the option to move back home with my job, and I immediately grabbed the opportunity. Wyoming was beautiful, but it never sadly felt like home. So I happily moved back and started getting settled into my old life and catching up with some old friends. One day I went to a local coffee shop to grab myself a treat before work for the day, and I spotted someone that looked familiar. The feeling must have been mutual because she was staring back at me awfully hard. I smiled at her and she waved me over. She'd been sitting alone on her laptop. When I walked over, she closed it and asked if I went to a certain high school. I confirmed, and at that time, it finally clicked for both of us. We definitely went to school together, and we used to be pretty good friends. I'll call her Alexa. We actually went to middle school together, and freshman year of high school before she moved away and we lost touch. I was surprised that we both remembered. She was always very outgoing and fun to be around, so I was pretty excited to see her, and she was looking happy and healthy. We agreed to meet up for dinner at some point to catch up more. Our first meetup was like stepping into a time machine. We had so much to talk about and reminisce on from our childhood. We discussed the teachers that we truly hated, the boys that we crushed on, and even talked about some secrets and rumors that we'd heard. We then moved on to talking about our current lives. We talked about where we lived, college, and what we did for a living. Alexa seemed to be in a good place in her life, judging by how happy she looked. She was also dressed nicely, and she said that she loved her job. She had started college, but said that she didn't really like how it was going, so she dropped out. But then she had landed a really great job anyways, that she'd been doing for the last 2 years or so. I asked her what it was that she was doing. It didn't really dawn on me at first, but she told me that she worked in sales. I thought that was pretty impressive because it's not something I was ever good at. I had a job for about 2 months in sales, and I hated it. So, I was impressed and congratulated her for it. We started hanging out a lot more. Typically it was on the weekends, as I worked the normal Monday through Friday. But as she described it, she set her own hours and would ask me to go out with her sporadically throughout the week. When we were together, we were usually going out to clubs, having dinner and drinks, just things like that. And I made the comments about her job being more flexible, and well, she agreed. She even suggested that I should try working with her. I declined, saying that I could never make it as sales was not my forte, as mentioned. But she was very pushy. She would say that my looks could reel in plenty of sales alone, and that I just needed to work with it. I laughed it off and told her that I would keep that in mind, but that I wasn't really interested. There were nights that we would go out, and if it got too late, sometimes she would crash at my place. But when I would get up in the mornings, or when we were just chilling in my living room, she would see things and make these weird comments. Like when she saw my laptop. She said that it looked sick, and I was telling her about the specs, and she said, "How can you afford a laptop like that doing what you do?" Sorry, I don't want to say what I do for several reasons, including this incident. I was kind of taken aback by the comment, but I just said that I'd saved up and that it was on sale and left it at that. But when she would see other things around my house, or things that I wore, she would joke that I was a credit card junkie, and that they would get me in trouble or that I must have a sugar daddy. It was weird, definitely, but I never lived outside of my means. I wasn't in debt, actually. I just knew how to budget well and had money set aside for emergencies, or when I wanted to splurge a bit on myself. Still, while the comments were weird, I just thought maybe she experienced something similar, so she knew what that kind of thing looked like. Hell, she had nice things too, so maybe that's how she got there. Maybe the job that she touted so hard wasn't as great as she had made it out to be. But back to her job thing. I did notice that she still never told me what company she even worked for, and I was still quite curious about it. One night while we were having drinks, I noticed that she seemed to be particularly busy on her phone, constantly messaging someone. It didn't really bother me, as it wasn't like she was being rude or ignoring me. The girl was a pro at multitasking, but I did ask her if everything was okay, and she just happily nodded and said that she was working. So finally I just came out with it. Where exactly do you work? What company has you working sales around the clock? I said this jokingly. And that's when she told me she worked for herself. So now I was even more curious. Finally, and with a creepy grin, she pulled out her phone and showed me a barrage of messages. Messages from guys, and a lot of them. Every single one of them were calling her a different name, saying they loved her, asking her about her day, asking if she needed anything, and some other things that I won't put into words, but you get the picture. She was leading all of these men on, and she was bragging about it. She talked about how so many of them were gullible, how she makes thousands between them on a weekly basis. She even bragged about how some of them had considered ending it with her, or started catching on, but they were married, and she blackmailed them. I was horrified as she explained all of this to me, but I did my best not to express it. I'm sure that I failed, though. I just remembered saying something like, "Wow, Alexa, that seems really intense and a lot of work to keep up with it. Is it really worth it?" She gave me a disapproving look and made a comment about how I sounded like a disappointed parent, and then laughed. So I laughed with her and told her that I just couldn't do something like that. She then turned her whole body to face me, and in a low and curious tone she said, "Are you gonna snitch on me now?" She sounded so serious, compared to how cheerful her tone had been all night. But I just told her no and said that that was a silly question. She then started laughing but quickly made eye contact again, and back in her chipper voice she said, "Oh good, I didn't want to have to dump you in a ditch somewhere. I kind of like you." And then proceeded to laugh again. I laughed with her, but I just remembered how uncomfortable the rest of that night made me feel. Once I went home that night, I started to become a bit paranoid. What she was doing was a huge deal. My mom has worked in banking her whole life, and she warned me and told me about many scams out there. and to always be on the lookout for them. But was Alexa being serious? Was she really willing to hurt me or possibly kill me for that lifestyle? I took a day for myself to reflect and decide on what I should do. I ultimately knew what the right thing to do was, but what proof did I have? How would they even be able to catch her or charge her? Not to mention, the look in her eyes seemed very real. So, still in a bit of fear, I decided to start by distancing myself from her. At first, I just declined her invites, saying something would come up or that I wasn't feeling well. But then she showed up at my place, knocking on the door with a bottle of Sprite and a container of soup. I thanked her, expecting her to just leave, but she seemed insistent on staying and wanting to come in. I tried to act sick and tell her that it could be contagious, as I got it from someone at work, but it did little to dissuade her. I finally got her to stand down, telling her that I was fine, and that as soon as I was better, that we should hang out. She smiled and agreed, and after hugging me, she walked off. I went back inside, and that's when I noticed that the Sprite had been opened, but nothing seemed to be missing from the bottle. Knowing Alexa, kind of, I could see her pouring herself a glass first, but that obviously wasn't the case. Something immediately felt wrong, so I just put it all in the fridge and forgot about it. But then I would start to actually get sick, but this time it was due to stress. Shortly after all this, I started getting bombarded with messages, calls, alerts, and emails for new bank accounts being opened. Credit cards, checking accounts, even loans being applied for in my name. I also received alerts about attempts being made to access my accounts online. I started to panic. Someone had obviously stolen my identity, but at the time I didn't know how or when. I was very careful with everything I did, thanks to my mom. I followed the normal steps of filing all the reports necessary and closing any accounts that I didn't request. But when I got the statements of my actual card, I saw some of the activity, and it finally started adding up. A lot of the transactions being made were either in my same area, or were places that I was not familiar with but I had heard of before. By Alexa. She loved shopping at Ulta. I did not, and there were tons of charges from there. I knew that it had to be her. All those intrusive comments and questions about my finances, this had to be why. While I wasn't in the room, she must have been snooping around to get as much information as she could. And I guess if I wasn't willing to join in on her scams, she would have to drain me of any funds that she could. I knew that I had to take action at this point, so I started by talking to my mom. I explained everything to her, everything Alexa was doing and what I suspected her of doing. She stressed the severity of the situation, and she urged me to go to the police. The first step was to report anything, and then they could take it from there. Feeling skeptical, but ultimately knowing it was for the best, I did file a report. And to my surprise, they actually did make me feel like it would make a difference. I stopped hearing from Alexa around the time all the reports started coming in. She just stopped initiating conversations, so I did too. I think we both knew why. But I provided the police report information to any banks that I had an open case with, and even that became easier. Accounts were closed and finalized, and I was starting to come out of it mostly unscathed. But that's also because they apparently were already on Alexa's trail. She wasn't just a scammer and a fraudster. She was involved in something far more severe. She was actually facing charges related to the death of one of her victims. I don't know if it was physically her doing, or if it could have been out of guilt or embarrassment, or maybe from her blackmailing them, but when I heard about it, it really set in for me just who I had become friends with. So maybe my fears of her weren't all that made up. Maybe it wasn't just paranoia, and maybe I did save my life, and possibly the lives of others. So, my last word of advice, I guess, if you see something, say something. You never truly know how much of it could help someone else out. Hello. I'm new to your channel, and I love the idea of being able to share our stories with you. I feel like it allows more of a connection with your listeners, and you make it incredibly easy to do so thank you for that. I have one that I often share with my friends, so I thought I would share it with you, too. This happened to me back in 2014. I didn't have the best relationship with my family. Both of my parents were abusive in their own ways to me and my two other siblings, but our paternal grandparents were our safe haven. We liked to go over there as much as possible to have a safe place to sleep and to eat. And I think that they knew too, but didn't know how to handle it. Being an adult now, I think they had a hard time knowing how horrible of a person their son was, and they didn't want to call the cops, or even CPS on him, and so they tried to make it up by taking care of us. I never was really close to my maternal grandparents, so they were really all that we had. My older brother ended up moving in with his dad, as he did have a different father, while me and my little brother had to endure it until we were old enough to leave. I moved out when I turned 18, and into a place with my friend until I could get my own place. But I felt guilty leaving my brother there. I felt like I was abandoning him, so once I had my own place, I tried to have him over as much as possible. When he turned 16, our parents more or less kicked him out, because they wanted to use our room, even though I was a girl and we shared a room, as a rented room for their friend. My older brother's room was already turned into an office or game room that none of us were allowed to go in. Because I wasn't willing to give them money for my brother, like I was paying child support for some weird reason, and they couldn't charge him for rent, they told him to leave. I had my own place at this point, so I happily took him in until he moved out at 19. I told him that he could stay as long as he wanted, but he got a good job and got a place with his girlfriend at the time. Sorry that I went off on a bit of a tangent there, but it does help to explain why I spend Christmas the way that I do. None of us kids really spend time with our parents. My older brother talks to his dad, of course, but we have no contact with our mom or our dad. And sometimes we'll text each other happy birthday, but that's about it. And when my paternal grandparents passed, we stopped even getting together for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Us kids will get together and have dinner, but that's about it. So instead of sitting home alone, I like to make use of my time and put some good out into the world. I like to volunteer at a local homeless shelter. I help out year-round there, but I also like to go and decorate for Christmas. I make a lot of baked goods and put together little shelf-stable baskets for them, and I pass them out. And I also help make a nice holiday dinner for all of them. I like to go the whole 9 yards because, well, they deserve it. Everyone deserves to have a happy holiday. On this year, we actually had one hell of a snow and ice storm, so the shelter was even more packed than normal. We would have people just stay on those nights that had bad weather and then leave the next day. And it was looking like that was going to happen that night, too. Real quick, to explain the shelter layout just a bit. It has the main area, which has a few TVs, some old couches, and tables. And towards the back is the kitchen with the buffet bar in front of it, where we pass out the trays of food. And to the left of the kitchen, we had a few rows of rooms, Basically, that just had beds and a small shelf for drawers. All donated, thankfully. So, the night was going along smoothly with very minimal hiccups. People would line up, get their plate, then grab a gift bag at the end. We had some people that preferred to be left alone, while others were very social and did their best to be in the Christmas spirit. One of those people was a man named Rabbit. And no, I'm not sure if that was his legal name or anything. That's just what he told everyone to call him. Rabbit had been at the shelter for a few months already. He seemed to really be trying to make the most of the situation, as he was always so cheerful and outgoing, and he was always singing. It was actually quite a breath of fresh air to be around. He helped keep the shelter clean and even helped others that were staying there. So when his demeanor completely changed, it definitely stood out to everyone. We had all been sitting around the lobby area, some people reading, drawing, a few were playing a card game, and others were just sitting by watching. Rabbit was one of those people playing the card game, and when the game ended, they were starting a new round. But Rabbit stood up and waved to them like he was done. His smile quickly dropped, and I noticed this as he sat back in the chair. I watched him at first, thinking maybe he wasn't feeling well, but there was something about the empty stare that had me concerned. I've experienced people that were under the influence, and even those with disorders like schizophrenia. This didn't seem like any of those, but at the same time, I didn't know what it was. I asked him if he was okay, and he slowly turned his head towards me, his expression remaining the same, and just said, "I'm waiting." Then turned his head slowly back facing forward, but looking at nothing. Curious, I tried to push it further and asked, "Waiting for what, Rabbit?" Without saying anything or looking at me, he stood up slowly and walked to the corner of the room. The literal corner, and just stared at it, his hands to his side and slightly hunched over. I decided to cautiously follow him. I know people can be unpredictable, so I didn't want to put myself in a dangerous situation, but something told me that I needed to check on him. I told Peter, one of the other workers that was still in the kitchen, since he was male, in case I might need help, and he watched as I approached. Once at Rabbit's side, I asked him if he was okay, but he didn't respond. I asked him again what or who he was waiting for. He would not take his eyes off of the corner of the room, but all he said was, "You don't get it." His normally bright green eyes filled with happiness now looked glazed over and hollow. It honestly worried me, so I had Peter help me escort him to the room that he'd been staying in. I was thinking maybe we could get him to lay down, and then we wouldn't have to worry about him hurting himself, or someone else. Or so I thought. We continued with our night after that. Everyone enjoying their meal, the little gift bags I made in each other's company, but I kept getting this nagging feeling at the back of my head that I could not shake. I asked one of the other volunteers if they had seen Rabbit at all, and they shook their head. No one had seen him since he went to his room, and with this odd change in demeanor, I was actually worried about him. So, once again, I told them I was going to check on him, and Peter agreed to go with me. As I approached his room, I could see the door was slightly ajar, but the light was off. So, maybe he was able to fall asleep. I slowly opened the door, but I could hear him softly talking and giggling, almost. When I didn't see him on the bed, I called out his name and reached for the light switch. And I still cannot get that sight out of my head. Once the light was on, I peeked my head to the other side of the room and spotted Rabbit. He was sitting in the chair, facing the wall, and pretty much drawing on it, with what looked like blood. It was everywhere. I soon realized that he was covered in blood from the torso down and on his hands. There was blood on the floor by him, and the wall was covered with little pictures and phrases, all done in blood. And this may sound weird, but if you've been around a lot of blood, I guess, or have ever had a serious injury, you know that coppery smell that it has. And that was all the room smelled like. I immediately told Peter to call an ambulance, and I tried calmly asking if Rabbit was okay, but I didn't want to cause him panic. He looked at me smiling and said, "I'm better than ever." I couldn't help but be taken aback. This man was obviously injured. He had to be, with this much blood around and him being the only one in the room. I was surprised he was still conscious. Since he was still acting normal, I suppose, I tried asking him if he was hurt, and not seeing any immediate source of the blood, I asked him where it came from. "Sometimes you have to let the color out. They were trapped inside me, you see?" he said, smiling at me with his arms outstretched. I did my best to remain calm and unbothered, but also tried to move fast to find out where he was bleeding from and stop it. We grabbed a few towels and asked him to clean up, but he just started undressing and wrapping the towels around him, all while singing Christmas songs. When the medics arrived, we explained what happened, and they started checking him out, but couldn't immediately find a wound. They told us to check on everyone else while they got him loaded up into the ambulance. After doing a check on the other guests and comparing it to the check-in book, no one was missing, and no one was injured. So they packed up and they took him in. We were then left to clean up all the blood in the room. It seriously looked like a murder scene. It was eerie and almost hard to look at. We managed to get it cleaned up and blocked off the room due to the bleach smell, and just hoped that Rabbit would be okay. The rest of the night went on without any other incident, thankfully. We have an emergency contact list at the shelter in case anything happens to the guests. They'll leave us names of people, if they have anyone, and sometimes we were even their emergency contact. In Rabbit's case, he had a brother listed, but we never heard from him, so we didn't know if it was really his brother, if they were estranged, etc. But he did show up at the shelter a few days after to collect all of Rabbit's things. He told us that he was okay, but the bizarre part was that they couldn't find a wound that would have caused that much blood loss. They said it was definitely his blood, because he started to become faint and pale at the hospital. But he kept up his cheery demeanor while he was there. He claimed that he didn't do anything to himself, or didn't remember either. His brother was grabbing his things as he was going to stay with him for a little while, and he thanked us for looking after him. He said that he knew Rabbit wasn't in a good place, but he didn't realize that he was homeless, and he confided in us that he hated himself for not knowing sooner. We did our best to comfort him, because a lot of people that we see do the same. Some won't tell their family and friends how they're living out of shame, or not wanting to burden them. I was just happy to see that he did have family that cared about him, and he was able to step in and help him. I just wish that I didn't have to witness what I did to learn that. So, there's my Christmas story. Thankfully, nothing that crazy has happened since then, but I do still volunteer there, so who knows what the next one will be like. My family moved around a lot when I was a child, mainly due to my dad's job. We moved 4 to 5 times before I was 6 years old. My mom wanted some stability for the family, which at this point comprised of her, my dad, myself, and my younger brother. So, in 1994, my old man went and bought an old derelict farm that was situated in a rural area in the southwest of the UK, a mile from the nearest village and a quarter mile from our neighbors. He purchased it at a property auction, and we had no prior viewing, just the pictures on display at the auction house. And this place was really old, and comprised of a few large fields and 2 interconnected yards filled with outbuildings and a derelict house. It had been a working farm in various forms for 500 years or so, and the house itself was 250 years old. We spent a year living elsewhere whilst the renovations took place, but would often go there on weekends to run around and to play. The first day we entered the dusty, half-collapsed 2-story house, we realized that the previous occupants had left loads of their stuff behind. The house had been vacated 25 to 30 years prior. Everything was dusty, moldy, and falling to pieces. And some of the highlights were dressing tables filled with old clothes and makeup. A wall in one room was plastered with rosettes won in equine competitions, and hanging from the banister at the top of the stairs were a row of small string nooses covered in fur. It's a barbaric but not uncommon way for farm folk to get rid of unwanted kittens, apparently. Now, this wasn't paranormal in any way, but Jesus Christ, it was a unnerving thing to see in an already creepy-looking house. It would take far too long to list everything that happened, so I'll list some highlights below before ending with what I consider to be the strangest occurrence. Loud bangs, loud enough to make you think someone had tipped over a wardrobe or something. Footsteps running up and down the long wooden hallway. Cold spots and breezy points throughout the house that changed from day to day. One night my grandparents were house sitting, and before they went to bed, they did a quick lock check. One room at the end of the house was filled with a thick mist. It was a clear night. All the doors and windows were shut, and the mist was exclusive to that room. They noped out of there and stayed at their own place that night. The next day, everything was back to normal. After living there for 6 months, my mom actually called the village priest in to bless the place. We weren't a religious family, but she was really at a loss about how to cope with everything. The priest arrived and then proceeded to sprinkle holy water in every room of the house. Once that was done, Mom walked him out to his car, and as soon as they got out of the house, he turned to her and said, "There's an incredibly dark presence in this house, and I'm never setting foot here again. I don't know what to suggest. I'm really sorry. Good luck." And then he got into his car and sped off. He had apparently been fairly neutral during the blessing, but as soon as he got out of the house, he went pale, and his whole demeanor changed instantly. Things got a lot more chill after a medium came around and told Mum to kind of embrace it, which she did. There was always this nagging feeling that you were never alone. It didn't feel malevolent, it felt observational, and sometimes sad in a wistful way. It's still very strange. Anyway, the weirdest thing that happened actually occurred during the renovation phase. Dad and his work crew had removed all of the old possessions from the house and made a huge bonfire in the yard. They burned it over the course of a few days until it was just a steaming pile of ash. The following weekend, my mom took me and my bro over for a picnic and to run around. We were feral little bastards and we needed it. At one point, Mom sat in a chair not far from the bonfire and noticed an envelope on the big mound of ash. Despite being in the center of this pile, the envelope had inexplicably not burned up. Mom could tell that there was something heavier than paper in the envelope when she opened it up, and an amethyst crystal dropped out along with the letter. The date on the letter was sometime in the early 60s, and was written by the childhood sweetheart of a girl who had lived at that house with her parents. It was a letter of condolence to the parents. Turns out, the girl had sadly ended her life in her room when she was around the age of 18. Her ex-boyfriend had heard about it and sent the parents a really sweet letter expressing his love, grief, and condolences. He also sent the amethyst crystal, as that was the girl's favorite stone. My bedroom had been the girl's room. This was evident from the contents when we first got there. My wardrobe was in the corner by the window looking out over the farm. I could never linger there for too long. The part of the room just felt unpleasant and tense. I've since wondered if that's the spot where the girl took her life. I guess the story of the letter isn't very paranormal, but the fact that the letter survived the bonfire is wild to me. So, yeah. We lived there for 6 years or so, and then moved again after my parents split up. The house has changed hands at least twice in the last 20 years. I live about 2 hours from this place nowadays, and my girlfriend and I are tempted to go visit and see how it's doing. I'm sure the owners would love to be regaled with odd anecdotes about the property. Just to clarify, aside from the weird feelings and the random bangs and noises, my brother and I were largely unaware of things that happened. We were only told later in life. Thank God. One thing that people don't tell you when you go into working at a store, or really any retail job, you learn to read people quickly. I feel like places that are high targets for robbery or theft, like gas stations, make this doubly true. I used to work at a small convenience store gas station when I was in my early 20s. And working those kind of jobs, you see all sorts of characters. But nothing could have prepared me for what turned out to be my last shift. And I don't think anyone will blame me for quitting after this all went down. It was a pretty typical night. Not sure what day of the week it was, but it was a weekday because we were pretty dead. And we would get fairly busy on the weekends. There was only the occasional customer pulling in to get some chips or a drink or fill their tank, but that was about it. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, a guy walked in that was wearing what looked like a security guard uniform. He seemed like any other late-night customer. Friendly, a bit tired. We were situated near some hospitals and other facilities that I could see having a need for a security guard, so he really didn't look out of place or anything. And there were 0 red flags. I watched as he walked around, browsing the aisles. He grabbed a few things, just the normal snacks and a Red Bull. He was even making casual conversation as he scanned for whatever he wanted, saying that he was working a double shift and that he was trying to get something to keep him going. I laughed, said that I knew all about that, and said that I hoped that it was at least entertaining work. There was literally nothing about him that made me suspicious, concerned, worried, or any other synonym for those words. He walked up, dropped off what he had. I scanned the items and then asked if he wanted a bag for it all. I then leaned down to grab one of the bags out of the box on the floor, and the second I looked up, there was a gun pointed right at my face. He just stared at me with cold eyes and said, "Empty the register." For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't believe that this was happening. The transition from a normal transaction and a normal customer to a gun in my face was jarring, to say the least. I remember sitting there and thinking, this can't be real, this has to be a prank. He was such a nice and conversational person. But the gun in my face was telling me that this was very real, and that this was not a joke. After a few seconds, I came back to reality. I did as he asked. I opened the register and started pulling the cash out of the register, which, being that it was late in the evening, wasn't that much. My mind was racing, as was my heart, And I was so worried about the whole thing going south and how quickly it could. He was so nonchalant. And at one point, the fact that he didn't do anything to hide his face or who he was crossed my mind, which actually scared me more. Like, there was a real possibility that he was not planning on leaving any witnesses to this robbery. Once I got all the bills out of the register, he grabbed it and stuffed it into his pockets. Then, he did something that I will never forget. He looked me straight in the eyes with his cold stare, mimed pulling the trigger, and shouted, "Bang!" I jumped half out of my skin, and I swear I let out a yelp like a hurt puppy. I thought I was dead. I thought he was going to pull the trigger and just blow me away. The feeling in my chest is one that I will never forget, and if I wasn't running on fear at that point, I would have blacked out and collapsed. Then he just turned away and walked to the door, laughing, as if it was the funniest joke ever. He literally walked out of the store like nothing had happened, got in his car, and took off down the road. And I was left standing there trying to process what had just happened. Once I was sure he was gone, I locked the door and called the police, and sent a text to my manager telling them to get there immediately, that we'd been robbed. The officers got there quickly. They took my statement, and I gave them all the info that I could, including the car and the logo on his jacket. When my manager arrived, he was able to get them in the back and got copies of the security tapes for them. The whole time they were there talking and discussing things with me, or him, I just felt vulnerable. And like everything was futile. The dude was brazen about this. Like he knew that he would never be caught. My manager then told me to go ahead and take a couple days off, and I told him that I didn't think I could do the job anymore. I was hit with some major PTSD over this. He asked me to think it over, which I really did. But when I showed up for my next shift, after those few days off, the minute the door chime went off, I nearly started screaming. I couldn't do it, and some people will call me a coward for it, but I told him that I had to quit. Thankfully, my manager was a good friend of mine, and he completely understood. He told me that if I ever wanted the job back, I could have it, and that he wanted me to just be okay with it. The robbery, though, it changed a lot of things, and I lost trust in people. The guy looked and seemed completely normal, professional even. He was dressed in what looked like a uniform. There was the blue-collar connection that I thought we had. Two people working the night shift and sympathizing with each other's struggles. Then, he pulled a gun on me and threatened my life for a couple $100. I actually had nightmares about the situation for a few months, after all was said and done. About the gun and him yelling bang like that. Thankfully, he was actually caught. But it wasn't in a good way. He tried the same thing in a neighboring town, but the clerk wasn't as cooperative and tried to physically fight him. He ended up shooting and killing the clerk, which made it worse. Knowing that he was willing to pull the trigger like that, it really made me realize how much of a brush with my end that this was. Knowing that he was behind bars did bring some relief, but I was still pretty messed up over that night. Hey guys, I hope this is the right place for this. I'm a 30-year-old male, and I'd like to start off by saying that I don't really believe in this type of thing, or at least, I didn't before. Some people in my family have always thought the paranormal to be real and claimed to have experiences, but until recently I've always chucked it up to their imaginations. Odd things have happened throughout my life, but I think I've always just shrugged it off, and applied some sort of logic to it. Things like, this house is just really old and makes noise. But I can't logically come up with a reason as to why certain things are happening anymore. I guess everything started around Thanksgiving of 2017. After about 25 years in the same house, my family, mom, grandparents, aunt, and I decided to abandon the family home and move out of state. We immediately regretted the decision and quickly moved back to Georgia, into a new 3-bedroom home. I took the entire basement as a bedroom, set up a hammock, and settled in quickly. After a few nights in the new place, I stopped having dreams. It seemed like no matter how much rest I got, it was just never enough. Apparently this was happening to the rest of the family as well, but we never really spoke about it. A few more weeks go by, and then my mother started losing weight out of nowhere. My grandparents' health started to decline, and my aunt began shutting herself in her room. By the end of the first year, my grandma, who only went from her bed to her chair, somehow broke her back from just sitting, but had bruises all over her back. My mom had lost somewhere around 60 pounds, and my aunt had pretty much went crazy, and my grandpa grew really irritable. It wasn't much longer after that my aunt disappeared and got admitted into a, excuse my choice of words, nut house. Once she got out, she just refused to come back and moved out. Around this time, I started having nightmares. Around October of 2019, those nightmares got so bad that I hadn't had a full night's rest in several weeks. Then, one night, each time I woke up, I felt paralyzed and numb. It was like somehow all of my limbs were numb and cold. Then, one night this happened, I saw a figure. I was a nervous wreck for a few days after that. I remember telling one of my coworkers, and they told me to sage and pray over the house. I remember looking that sort of thing up to understand the whole point of it, and I was skeptical, but I did it anyway one night while my family was out. I walked every room of the house, upstairs and down. I even went into the bathrooms. I burned sage and prayed for what seemed like easily an hour or two. Later that evening, my family came home and were none the wiser. However, that night was different. It was quiet, peaceful. I remember it so perfectly because I think that was the first time since we moved in that I had managed to sleep comfortably. Unfortunately, the next morning, everyone else in the house had gotten extremely sick. My grandpa and I were the only ones who weren't admitted into the hospital that day. Luckily enough, everyone recovered, and things were fine for a couple of months. Then, before the pandemic went into full swing, 3 other family members moved into the house with us, and took over the living room. Great aunt and second cousins. With them came several dogs, who were always playful and calm. Then, for who knows why, stuff started happening again. Mom started to lose weight again. Grandma and Grandpa's health went downhill, and I started having nightmares again. The other 3 family members began to bicker and argue like I had never heard from them, and their dogs started barking at all hours of the night. This continued on for months, and the situation just kept getting worse. Everyone was growing irritable and miserable. Eventually, those extra family members moved out, and I began spending less time at the house, even though we were going through a pandemic. I met my now wife and moved out rather quickly with her. My family stayed in that house, though, and I just visited on the weekends. A few months later, my mom had lost well over 140 pounds, but the doctor said she was healthy. Also, during this time, my grandma's health had gotten so bad that she was admitted into a nursing/physical therapy facility. She spent about 3 to 4 months there before coming home. During that time, I had gotten married, and sadly, a week later, my grandma had passed away. And that was in the beginning of summer in 2021. That left my mom and grandpa in the house. I can't really speak on if they had any weird occurrences between that time and now, because I didn't live there anymore. They never spoke about those kinds of things, and when I visited, I never brought it up or asked questions. I didn't see the point or make any weird connections. That was until recently. Sadly, my grandpa passed in February of 2023. Since then, my mom has finally moved in with my sister and is taking her time getting her stuff from the house. Well, it's been about 3 weeks since the funeral, and as of today, I think I'm terrified. I don't know what to think or do other than sit here and draw connections to strange things that have happened the last few years. Heck, that's why I'm here sharing all this information. Last Thursday, I was driving home from work at roughly 3:10 p.m. I was passing by the old house my mom was moving out of, and I saw someone I didn't recognize from a distance. The road was maybe a football field away from the house, so it was hard to tell who it was. Once I got home, had dinner, and spent time with my family, I called my mom and asked her what she had moved out that day. Apparently she hadn't been there at all that day, and started freaking out thinking someone was trying to steal from the house. She, my sister, and some of my sister's friends went up there to check out the place. Later that night, my mom called me back to tell me what had happened. She said that no doors or windows had been broken, but the doggy door cover was ripped off, and the house had some strange, nasty cologne-like smell all throughout. While they were there, none of them felt safe, but they searched the house to see if anyone was there, and found no one. My sister apparently got tired of looking around, so she went into the pantry to find that all of the snacks and drinks were missing. Apparently a huge fuss was made, and they thought someone had broken in just to steal food. Until my sister and her friends heard some strange sounds. Then, eventually, they heard a voice telling them to get out. This scared the crap out of them, and they went outside immediately. They were freaking out and yelling at my mother to get out too, claiming there was a ghost. But my mom didn't hear anything, thought they were being dramatic, and started poking fun at them. She even began talking, cursing, and threatening the quote-unquote ghost, all throughout the house to prove a point. I guess this was a bad idea. Something scared my mother so bad that she just kind of shut down and refused to explain. After we got off the phone, I told my wife about it and laughed a little. I honestly thought that they were just hearing things. But then something happened today. I got off work early, and I went by the old house, alone. I wanted to get some tools that I left in the garage, but I never made it. You see, I pulled into the driveway, got out of the car, and felt something weird. And once I got to a breezeway door, before I could even reach for the doorknob, I felt like how I used to feel in the middle of the night, numb and paralyzed. I also felt empty, like I had been hollowed out. Then I felt a lot of pressure, like I was carrying a really heavy weight. I got scared, so scared that I started trembling. My first instinct was to get back into my car, so I ran to it and I left. I pulled into a nearby gas station, but by this time I was a nervous wreck. It took me nearly an hour to calm down. Once I did, I went in and got me something to drink and some gas. And for some reason, I got the bright idea to go back. The second time I pulled into the driveway and parked my car, I grabbed my gun out of the glove box and went to go into the house once again. But it was the same thing all over. But the feeling was so much worse. I couldn't see anything, but something was there. It felt giant and threatening. That presence was so overwhelming, overpowering, and just outright awful. Even with my gun in hand, I turned and ran back to the car. This time I nearly wrecked on the way out of the driveway. I was headed home, but instead I went to a friend's place. I didn't tell her anything about what was going on, just that I needed her to come see something with me. I felt like she would understand better than me. The reason I went to her was because she comes from a Haitian family, whose roots run deep. She doesn't practice voodoo, but knows about it and has several family members who swear by it and live that lifestyle. But she's also one of those energy and vibe type people. She knew something was wrong with me, and was worried because I wouldn't explain, but she came with me anyway. As soon as I pulled into the driveway of that old home, she began to cry and freak out. I hadn't told her anything, and she loved my family, so there was no reason for her to act that way. She started yelling at me to leave, so I did. As I was driving back to her place, she started yelling at me and punching me in the shoulder over and over. She was angry at me, but eventually she calmed down and we started to talk. She told me to never bring her back to a place like that again. I asked her what she meant, and she said, "A place that has an evil spirit." I asked her a bunch of questions and apologized before dropping her off. I got home maybe 3 or 4 hours ago. I originally came online to research stuff, somehow ended up on this forum, and just thought I should share. Truth be told, I really hope this is just mine and my family's minds playing tricks on us. Maybe we're just grief-stricken. We might just all be a little crazy. But through all of this, the one thing I know that is real is that terrifying sense of fear that I felt today. And it definitely has my nerves shook. I wanted to share a story that happened to me back in 2019. I used to work in a large toy store located at our mall. I actually loved the place. It wasn't your typical children's store with Barbies and stuffed animals. It had anything you could think of related to toys or hobbies, including puzzles, craft supplies, games, and much more that I can't think of. I had shopped there on many occasions because it was closer than some of the other local retail stores and had better variety. I started working there when I was 18, shortly before I graduated. The perks were pretty well worth it, even having to deal with the angry moms. But the mall also attracted some odd people, which is why I'm telling you this story. So, the mall I'm at is pretty long, but it has 2 floors, and my store was on the bottom floor and close to the middle. We also tend to see and hear a lot of the activity outside of the store, because we're close to the carousel that's in there as well, right by the ice cream kiosk. And so there's typically a lot of activity around us. And while we did have the occasional mean customer walking through the door, we didn't often get people that were so disruptive that we would have to kick them out. But then walks in a man that I will call Happy. I was at the front picking up some toys that had toppled over when this guy walked in, stopped at the entrance and shouted into the store, "It's a wonderful day in the USA!" At first I thought the guy was pretty eccentric, so I looked over at him and chuckled and said, "And good afternoon to you." He seemed to appreciate my acknowledgement and walked over to me. When he got closer, I could tell that he was definitely drunk. I could smell the alcohol wafting from him, and I could only assume what the stain on his shirt was from. His eyes looked heavy and his speech was slurred. Yet, he was the happiest drunk that I'd ever encountered. I just hoped that he didn't drive there like that. So, he approached me and asked, "How are you doing, love?" But again, it wasn't in a creepy way, and it was just friendly, so I didn't take offense to it. I told him that I was fine and asked if he was okay, given the circumstances, and he said that he'd never been better. He asked me if I had plans for the holiday, and I said that I did, to which he seemed very pleased with this, and began digging in his coat pocket. He then literally pulled out a wad of bills. There was no rhyme or reason to them, and, in fact, a few fell to the floor and he didn't even seem to notice. I picked up the bills that fell all while he continued talking to me, and when I tried to hand them back, he held out a $100 bill to me saying, "Take this and have a Merry Christmas, love." I smiled with a slight chuckle, but shook my head, telling him that I couldn't accept it. He made an exaggerated, "Aw, man, I just wanted to do something nice." I told him that I appreciated the thought, and that it was nice, but that I just couldn't accept it per my job. He understood, grabbed the bills from me, and stuffed it all back into his pocket. He then went in for a hug, which I accepted. Once again, not getting any real weird vibes from him, and he happily walked off down one of the aisles, with a bit of a skip in his step even. However, he still let his presence be known. He practically narrated out loud everything that he was looking at. "Oh, this little guy walks, and roars. Nice, it dances." He wasn't really hurting anything, just being a little louder than the rest of us. My manager started getting annoyed because he would knock stuff down, because he obviously wasn't walking straight. But if he noticed it, he would turn and immediately pick it back up. After a few aisles, my manager had enough of it, while the rest of us thought he was just having a good time and not hurting anybody. She went and confronted the guy, and said that he was causing too much chaos, and that if he didn't make a purchase in the next 5 minutes, then he needed to leave. He turned to her with an exaggerated frown, and from what I could see, tried to offer her some cash too, which she refused. He then made his way back up to the front, waved to all of us, and left. So, we just continued about our day and picked up the items he had dropped and left behind. Everything seemed to go back to normal for probably about half an hour tops, when I started to notice a small crowd forming outside of the store. I didn't think anything of it at first, especially being in a mall. People stop randomly for a break, to organize bags. Sometimes they'd even start talking to someone they were with or ran into. But it wasn't until I saw them looking up and pointing that I became curious. When I got the chance to step away, I walked out to the front of the store and looked at where everyone's attention seemed to be. And I figured it out. Happy was on the top level, looking down to the bottom. He was saying or singing something that I couldn't quite make out. But what I could understand were the bills that he seemed to be slowly dropping to the bottom, on purpose. People were standing around trying to grab them as they slowly fell, or playfully fighting as they picked them up off the floor. While everyone seemed to be having a good time with it, including Happy, something was giving me a bad feeling. I was going to head back in and ask my manager if there was something that we should do, but the screaming from the people were becoming louder, making me think something was happening. I turned back to the crowd and saw that Happy was now crawling onto the railing and sitting on it, with his feet now dangling over the edge. I immediately became nervous about this, knowing that it was not going to end well. What if people got out of control down by us because of the money? What if someone above noticed this and starts fighting with Happy, causing him to fall? I yelled back into my store and told someone to call security, but quickly went back outside to watch what would happen. I tried to get people to keep walking and not huddle, saying that it was a safety issue to block a store's entrance, which wasn't entirely false, but no one would budge. They all stood where they were, waiting for more money to drop. Not long after, I saw 2 security guards approaching. I pointed to Happy and tried to quickly explain, but one guard was already running towards the stairs while the other one stood nearby, ordering people to leave, which finally worked. But then the feeling of dread that was approaching finally hit its climax, as Happy yelled something about love. I couldn't quite tell what he said, held his arms out wide, closed his eyes and leaned forward until he fell off the railing. It all seemed to go in slow motion, yet I was frozen in fear, not knowing what to do. I watched him fall to the ground as he hit a bench directly below. The sickening thud echoed through the mall, and he flopped off the bench onto the ground, motionless. I stood there as I took in everything around me. Some people still nearby were screaming, trying to snap photos and looking for more loose bills. The security guards were calling for an ambulance as they were trying to care for Happy, who was now unresponsive and lying in a pool of blood around his head. More people from my store and the one across the way came out and were watching too. I was terrified, nearly holding my breath just thinking that I watched this man fall to his death, and that I was no better than the rest of the people that stood by to watch. Thankfully, the EMTs showed up, and as they put him in the head and neck brace, he groaned, at least telling me he was still alive. The aftermath became kind of a blur. One of the janitors came by to clean up the blood, which was a decent amount. People slowly dispersed, and we were told to continue working, with that image now burned into my head. I was thinking about it the rest of the night. Where did Happy come from since he was so obviously intoxicated? Why did he have so much cash on him? And why was he so willing to just give it out? Most importantly, why did he fall? It was obviously intentional, but none of it made sense. I never saw the guy again, so I also don't know what happened, but it's still fresh in my mind, especially around this time of year. I just hope that he turned out alright, and that I never have to experience something like that ever again. So, this happened to me many years ago. Throughout most of my middle school and my high school years, I had this best friend that I will call Kendra. Kendra and I were pretty inseparable. We did everything together. We were typically at each other's houses, talking on the phone, chatting on Facebook, always something. As graduation got closer, we started making our life plans, and we knew that we wanted to get a place together. It didn't take us long to find a place and get approved for it. I was going to be attending the university in the next state over, and the drive from our place was only going to be about a 45-minute drive, which wasn't bad. I had actually worked on a project. It was more like a contest, I feel, but for whatever legal reason, they didn't call it a contest, where I won a scholarship to this university. And they had a great program that was in the field that I wanted to major, so there was no way that I was passing up the opportunity. Kendra was going to be attending the local community college, which was only about 20 minutes from our place, so even closer for her. She said that she was just going to start there because she still wasn't quite sure what she wanted to major in. We even both worked at the high-end department store, but at different locations. When we got our place together, she transferred to the store that I worked at because she claimed that she had some issues with someone she was working with. It was such a great time in the beginning. It was like we were still in school. Sometimes we rode to work together, we would go grocery shopping together, or even just hang out at home talking, joking, and gossiping just as we always did. Sometimes we even sat out on our patio and did our homework together, or just complained about doing it at times. But things started to change, and I would have never expected any of this from Kendra. One of the first red flags was her growing resentment whenever I mentioned plans involving anyone other than her. It would start as just saying that I was going to hang out with someone from uni or someone that I used to work with. She would sound upset, and my initial reaction would be to apologize and ask if she wanted to join. She always declined, and then would say with a smile, "No, go have fun with your friend, it's fine." But it was pretty obviously a fake happiness for me. Me, not really knowing how to handle conflict, would just say okay and leave. But it became less fake and more passive remarks. Even when I would bring someone over to hang out with, she was always rude to them, and then even to me, but would apologize immediately after they left, giving some lame excuse about not feeling well or something like that. We got into a small argument when I said that I was going to see my mom and my sister. Ever since I was around 12 or 13, my mom would take one day out of every month and take my sister and I out on a mom-daughter day. My dad did the same thing with my brother. It was just a time for us to talk about anything and everything, vent, share accomplishments, really whatever we wanted, and I absolutely appreciated it. We kept up with it after I moved out, because I think all of us kind of missed me being around. My sister was still in high school at the time. When I was getting ready to leave, Kendra asked about going with me, and I apologized and told her that this was the one time that I would really decline it, as it was my time with them. She threw a fit. She accused me of not involving her in anything, and forgetting about her. I didn't understand where this was coming from because she knew about this get-together. I didn't really understand why she was so upset. But one of the biggest blows came out when, after I made dinner for us, I said I was going to meet up with a friend from uni to work on a project that was coming up. And, once again, she made remarks about me being annoying. I didn't know where this came from and asked her what her problem was. She unleashed some pretty hurtful torrents of accusations and belittling of me for my academic choices. She actually tried to guilt-trip me for choosing to go to uni instead of the community college with her. She said that I was supposed to be willing to go to school with her since we were supposed to be best friends. Then, she kept making remarks about being Ms. Perfect, and how I felt like I was better than her because of it. I was pretty upset. She knew how hard I had worked for that scholarship, and how important it was to me. She had even encouraged me to pursue it, so I didn't understand. Why did I have to bend over to attend the same school as her when she had no drive and no goals in her life? Was I supposed to give up mine? So, those incidents alone caused a pretty big rift in our friendship. We still had good days after that, but it wasn't the same. I felt like I had to tiptoe around things that I would talk about to not set her off. I even told my mom about it, and she said that if she kept this up, then I should consider not renewing the lease with her when it was up. And I sadly had to agree. The next big blow-up would come when I started seeing this guy from my school. When I would be with him, Kendra would blow up my phone like a stalker or possessive and jealous partner. I say this because my boyfriend actually thought maybe I was seeing someone else and was hiding it from him. When he finally came over one day and met her, he finally understood. And he believed me when he saw how overbearing she was. She even had the audacity to tell me that she didn't like it when I brought friends over, and that he wasn't allowed to come back. I can understand not wanting someone over that makes you uncomfortable, and if your name is on the lease, like it was for both of us, I think you have the right to say this. But that's obviously not what this was. He had come over maybe 4 times. Once to have dinner, once while he waited for me to get ready, once to work on homework with me, and another to just pick me up. He never even stayed there overnight. He was never in the room alone with her. She was obviously, again, just mad at me, and was using this as a way to punish me. So, finally, it was my turn to snap. And I told her that she was acting like a jealous ex, and that I didn't appreciate her treating me like that. I left, and actually stayed with my boyfriend for the weekend. One of those days I was off, and the other day I did have to work. I cringed at having to see her. However, she never showed up. It was a normal day that she worked, so even though I was mad, I was kind of concerned for her. She hadn't messaged me all week and she wasn't responding to me, so I left early to go home and check on her. Getting home, she was definitely there, but she wouldn't come out of her room. She yelled at me through the door that she was fine and that she just wasn't ready to talk to me. She sounded okay, so I just went about the day until I had to leave for school that evening. I didn't see her again until the next day at work, where she would finally show up. But I wasn't the first one to see her. A few people that I worked with had made jokes about my twin being here, and when I saw her, I was shocked. She had gorgeous mid-length coppery blonde hair. She had cut it into a bob, dyed it black, and had hot pink bangs. Just like mine. It was pretty clearly obvious what she was doing. But yet, she was completely chipper and in a really good mood. Even when she saw me. Not knowing how to react, she said that she just wanted to try something different. I mean, what do you say to your estranged friend who is now looking exactly like you? But that same week, she would come home with a nose piercing, then an eyebrow piercing, just like me. I tried to ask her what she was thinking and what she was trying to do, and she acted like she didn't understand the question. One of the biggest betrayals came after her transformation. I was hanging out with my boyfriend at school when he started looking at his phone confused. I asked him what was going on, and he asked me if I had created a new Facebook profile. I told him no, and he showed me a profile that tried to add him as a friend. It was Kendra. I knew it was. She was obviously trying to copy my profile picture, but you know your friends. This was her, but her name was something different. Almost cryptic. I don't remember what it was because it was a weird mix-up of my name. Curious about what her goal was, I told him to add her. He did, and immediately after she started messaging him and flirting with him. She kept saying that she wanted to hook up with him, and as she continued, I was getting angrier and angrier. So they set up a time that night, and both of us showed up with her. To say that she was surprised to see me there was an understatement. I flew off the handle. I demanded to know what the hell her problem was, why she was doing everything she had done so far, why she was trying to look like me, why was she trying to become me. And in a completely normal, unfazed tone, she mentioned that she thought if she was a little more like me, that I would like her more, or that others would like her and that she would be successful. I did not understand her mentality. We were always outgoing and had many friends in school. We both hung out with a lot of other girls that all got along with both of us. She was very attractive and dated here and there too. I didn't know why she was doing this. I told her that she was being unreasonable and, to be honest, pretty creepy. So, I once again left. I called my mom that night and actually stayed at home. My parents told me it was probably best to go ahead and move out for safety reasons, and that I was welcome to stay with them. They were just as shocked as I was. They adored Kendra, and she was treated like one of their kids. Kendra had a good family too. She had 2 younger siblings, and I knew her parents. They were both always caring and very supportive. I did end up moving out that week. I told the property owner and paid my half of the rent and the fee for breaking the lease. I wrote a letter to Kendra saying that I was moving out and that her side of the rent was still required, but that mine had been taken care of. She never called or texted me after that, not even via Facebook or something, so I just thought, there goes a lost friendship. However, while she never contacted me by her number or her original Facebook profile, she had tried to add me as a friend under various names. And I've even gotten calls from random numbers of just breathing. The Facebook profiles are definitely her because she uses the same photos. But while I can't be certain that the phone numbers are all her, it's pretty damning that it didn't start until after I moved out. Like I said, this happened quite some time ago, but I still get random Facebook requests from her and she still looks like me. I even changed my hair, and wouldn't you know it, she somehow found out and changed hers too. It's just creepy to me that after so long, she is still out there, watching me, following me around, and she cannot seem to move on. So, Kendra, in the off chance that you see this, please move on. And just leave me alone. Okay, so bear with me for this story here. This was a very real event, but it's still something that I have a hard time believing, and I was there for it. I used to live in an apartment with an old friend of mine named Wade. We both got along great and rarely had disagreements or issues with chores or other duties around the apartment. The biggest issue that we ever really had was the following. Wade was going on a retreat for about a week. From what I got out of him, it was some religious thing. Now, I wasn't religious, but I knew that Wade's parents were, and that they were heavily involved in their church. Wade had never really expressed his views one way or another. It wasn't anything we ever really talked about, so I assumed that this was something he may have been doing with his parents. Something they asked him to do, or maybe he was genuinely interested in it and wanted to find himself. Either way, I supported him doing what made him happy, and held down the place waiting for his return. But it was when he returned that things started getting a little weird. Wade returned late from his retreat one night. I was already getting tired as I was watching TV in the living room when he came home, and he seemed wired and awake. I figured it was just the jitters and excitement, maybe from the flight, or that he was excited to share with me what he learned and experienced. He began explaining how the retreat went, while also not discussing what exactly it was for, so, again, I assumed what it was for. I ended up going to bed because I was pretty tired, but he still seemed very much awake. However, him being wide awake at night seemed to become the norm for him. In fact, he even changed shifts at work so that he worked overnight. When he wasn't coming out to get ready for work, he stayed in his room and pretty much became reclusive. which was very odd for Wade. He was very much the type to be around people and talk non-stop, so it was definitely unlike him. Slowly, he even stopped having dinner with me. He would brag to others and tout how lucky he was to have me as a roommate, because I'd gone to culinary school and we rarely had a box meal. I even continued to make enough for him, but when it would go uneaten for a few days, I would just feel bad that the food was going to waste. Initially, I assumed that he was just adjusting to his new routine, but as time went on, it became clear that something was definitely wrong. Especially when I noticed the heavy, dark blankets now covering his window. I could see one from the parking lot when I got out of my car, but it wasn't until I received a package for him during the day that I stumbled upon the horrifying truth. I was watching TV in the living room when there was a knock on the door. It was a package that had to be signed for, and I realized it was for Wade. I made my way to Wade's room to give it to him, thinking that if I had to sign for it, it was probably important. We had our own rule for entering each other's rooms. We always knocked if the door was closed, but even if we didn't answer, we could typically still enter, as long as our sign on the door wasn't flipped. It was kind of our coded way of saying do not disturb, like if we wanted to be left alone or if we had a girl over. The signs were these cheap little superhero signs that his mom got us as a joke. But while one side was like a whiteboard, the other just had the superhero on it. So if it didn't have our name sight out, we knew it meant do not disturb. We did this because I'm epileptic, so I never locked my door in case I ever had a seizure and he or someone else needed to get in. So, anyways, the sign showed his name, which meant that I could go in. I guess that he forgot to flip it or lock the door because I don't think he wanted me to see what I saw. When I walked in, I saw Wade sitting at his desk with just his desk lamp on. However, he had blood on his cheeks and running down his arms. His pants and shirt were also wet with what I assumed to be blood coming from what looked like some kind of organ that he was eating from his hands. He looked like an animal as he tore into that thing. I was disgusted and shocked and asked, "Wade, what the hell are you doing?" His response was even more unsettling. I didn't want you to find out this way, man, but I'm a vampire. I have to eat this so that I don't hurt you," he said as he shook the meat in his hand at me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Wade was typically a pretty smart guy. He didn't really have much in way of crazy thoughts or ideas, and knowing the background that he came from, I didn't think he was much of a believer in stuff like that. Not knowing how to respond, I tossed his package on his bed and shut the door behind me, going to my own room. He didn't even try to talk to me the rest of the day, nor do I think he even came out of his room. I mean, how are either one of us going to respond to that situation? But as I was once again watching TV one evening, he came out to go to work, and since he mustered up the courage to talk to me, I knew that I had to be a good friend and listen to his reasoning. He explained to me that shortly before the retreat he started feeling ill, and was constantly tired and he didn't know why. However, he made the cardinal sin of trying to search for answers on the internet, and what did he stumble upon? That retreat. They explained the same symptoms he was experiencing and claimed to have the answers, so he thought he would check it out, expecting it to be some kind of clinical thing. What it really was some vampiric cult. They explained that he was feeling the way that he was because he was a bona fide vampire, and that he needed pure blood to survive. That he needed to be in the dark at all times, and that's why he changed when he returned. It explained his change in shifts, the reclusiveness, and even his taste for, I guess, organ meat. But the good thing about me is that I'm very blunt, and will tell you exactly what you need to hear. So I told him that he needed to go to a real doctor as it sounded like it could be medical, but that being diagnosed as a vampire was not it. He finally saw my side of things and agreed that he would at least go and see what they said. He did choose a 24-hour walk-in clinic, so I drove him there one night and, wouldn't you know it, he actually had some kind of deficiency that simple supplements and medication could fix. No more needs for any bloody organ feasts. I swear it. I took him back home, and after taking the supplement for a few days, he started feeling better. He even had more energy to the point that he changed his shift again because he was having trouble staying awake at night. I even watched him bring a bag full of organs that he kept in his mini fridge in his room because he didn't want me to see them or freeze them. He was buying these things weekly to eat. Thankfully, he began eating regular food with me as well. That night, the terror reached its peak, but the relief that followed was immense. I thought that my friend was, no, not a vampire, but had gone crazy, and I didn't know how far he would have taken it if I hadn't caught him, or he hadn't told me. So, that's the story of my crazy friend Wade, and yes, I still give him crap about it to this day. I used to work at a certain cheap little jewelry store in a decent-sized shopping mall here in my hometown. You can all probably guess the name of the store. I'm not going to put it out there because they didn't have anything to do with what happened, so I don't want to drag their name or anything. It was a pretty mundane job, with the usual challenges, nothing too crazy really. I think the hardest things that I had to do were watch out for teen girls who would try to pocket random earrings. It really wasn't hard to tell when they were going to try and steal something. And if you stood over them, they would usually abandon their plans and just leave. There was one year, though, where things got weird and creepy. It actually involved the mall's Santa Claus, which was a huge attraction for our mall near Christmas time. I've never really liked mall Santas. When I was a little kid, I would always burst into tears when my mom would take me to see them, and as an adult, they just kind of creeped me out. In this specific year, the mall had hired a new Santa because the one that had done the job the previous decade had, sadly, been diagnosed with cancer, and he wasn't able to do the job anymore. The new Santa was, to put it kindly, a bit different. He wasn't quite large enough to fill the role, and he didn't have a jolly look in his eyes. He looked rather cold and distant every time I saw him. The kids didn't seem to mind, and I think the parents were just happy to keep the tradition going, so it was what it was. One night I was working the closing shift at my store, just stocking, sorting, and cleaning up like always. I was finishing up something in the back room of the store when I heard the front door chime go off. We were closed, so I initially thought that it was just my coworker coming back from getting food before the Chinese place closed. But when I walked up to the front, I froze. Standing in the middle of the store was none other than Santa Claus. Something about him was off. He looked a bit haggard, kind of wired and wily, like he couldn't quite focus on anything in particular. Worse yet, his beard was half undone and just sort of hanging there. "Can I help you?" I managed to stammer out, thinking that he had to have a reason to be there, right? At first he didn't respond. He just stood there staring at me wide-eyed like he didn't expect me to actually speak to him. Then, in a raspy and almost desperate voice, he said, You know they're not real. They're not real. None of this is real." I wasn't really sure what to say to that. Was this some kind of joke or something? His eyes told me that it wasn't. He looked genuinely disturbed, haunted even. I just sort of nodded at him and said, "Sir, I think you should go ahead and leave." Instead of leaving, he took a huge step forward, causing me to quickly step back and behind the counter. He then continued on with, "You don't get it. They're watching us. All the time. Watching!" At this point, I was genuinely scared. I grabbed the phone and hit the button for security. But the second that I did, Santa turned tail and ran out of the store. I mean, full on sprinted out of the store. I quickly walked over to the door and pulled it shut and locked it, while I was also explaining to the security guard what had happened. The guard showed up and asked me a few more questions, then mentioned that my store wasn't actually the only one that this guy had been acting strange at. Apparently he'd actually gone off on the cashier at Spencer's, like verbally assaulted him about the same things that he was saying to me. The next day, the Santa station was closed, and he was seemingly gone. There were some rumors about how Santa had a breakdown, how he was on drugs, and there were even talks about the possibility of him having been a mentally ill homeless man that somehow landed the job. I have no idea. I never learned the truth about him, and based on the conversation we'd had, it could have been any of it. Worse yet, about a week or two later, I actually saw the man again. It was well after close. I was walking out to my car, and I saw him standing in the parking garage, still wearing the Santa outfit. 2 weeks later. He was just walking around the parking garage aimlessly, kind of stumbling about and mumbling to himself. I did end up calling the security guard, whose cell phone number I had, and he said that he would check it out, but I never got a follow-up. In the end, this was just more ammo for me to dislike mall Santas, for me to be afraid of them, honestly. I didn't see him again after that. The mall hired another person to fill in, and life went back to normal, thankfully. I'm not really sure how to end this story after that. I guess I'll just say that it was obviously creepy, and I'm kind of glad that he took off, because he kind of looked like he was going to do something much more violent. Christmas has always been a very heartfelt and magical time for our family. Most of the family has dispersed throughout the Midwest, some on the West Coast, and we don't get to see each other very often. I still live in my hometown, so I get to see my grandma and parents on the regular, but there are those of us that only come together during this specific time of year. Like a lot of people, my grandmother and grandfather basically run the holidays. Everyone shows up at their house because it's big enough for everyone, and they love hosting. They've hosted as far back as I can remember. And on Christmas, it is everyone there for the celebrations. And that scene being painted for you, I have a story about a very specific Christmas that happened a long time ago. One that, well, let's just say that it stuck with everyone. I was around 6 years old at that time, in that age where Christmas is still this amazing and magical time of the year, and where the mention of Santa Claus would get me all giddy and excited. The room was full of relatives, people talking to each other, enjoying the company. My cousins and I were all gathered around the Christmas tree and trying to guess which gifts were ours. My grandma was in the kitchen with my mom, and really it was just a great afternoon. Then, suddenly, the festive atmosphere was shattered by a loud bang on the front door. which caught everyone's attention. Before anyone could react and go to the door to see who it was, the door literally burst open, and in walked a man dressed like Santa Claus. He wasn't a jolly and rosy-cheeked Santa that I was used to. I remember thinking that he looked sad, and like he needed to wash his hair. But in my eyes, he was Santa, and I was excited. He bellowed out a classic, "Ho, ho, ho!" as he staggered into the room. I remember shouting, "Guys, it's Santa!" And when I looked around, I remember seeing the adults all just standing there and staring at this man that was trudging into the house. To me, it was just Santa making this really cool, dramatic entrance. And I was sitting there clapping in delight, completely unaware of what exactly was going on and why everyone else looked like they were upset or confused. My dad stepped into the room and angrily asked who the hell this man was. I remember I was angry with him for being so rude to Santa. Santa let out a harsh laugh and said, "I'm Santa. I'm just here to spread some holiday love and cheer." It was then that my aunt paled and said, "Rick?" I asked who Rick was, of course, and I didn't get an answer. Then Santa laughed and said, "Oh, there's my dear ex-wife, looking jolly as always." I was super excited at this point, because again, in my head, my aunt was once married to Santa Claus. I was confused as to why she was calling him Rick, though. I didn't know his name was Rick. It was about this point that my dad stepped up again and told this man that he needed to leave, saying that he had 10 seconds to get out before he called the cops. It was about this point where the situation shifted in my mind. Clearly this wasn't okay. This Santa apparently wasn't supposed to be there and had definitely done something wrong. This was proven to me when the man said, "Now, let's not ruin Christmas for everyone. We don't want things to get ugly. I mean, I might have a gun in here." It was about this point that my mom grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the scene. The whole time I'm asking about why Santa would have a gun in his sack, and said, "Who asked for a gun for Christmas?" It was such an awkward situation for me, and I'm sure my cousins as well, but I was just so confused as to what was going on. I remember that while my mom was talking to me in the kitchen about nothing in particular, I could hear people shouting in the living room, including Santa, and people just telling him to get out of the house. At some point, he must have realized that he was outnumbered, because he did leave. I recall the rest of that night being very, very saddened. The entire festivity had been ruined for me. My dad had called the cops to report what had happened because the guy had threatened us, but also because he was clearly drunk and was driving away. I remember my dad talking to the cops and me trying to tell them not to arrest Santa, and said that he just needed a hug because he was sad. Well, I found out much later that Rick was, apparently, my aunt's ex-husband, as he'd mentioned. They had been divorced for over 3 years due to his abusive behavior and his alcoholism. He had no other connections to our family, and his unexpected, terrifying intrusion on our Christmas gathering was a pretty horrible reminder of my aunt's past. My mom actually told me about all of this quite a few years later, when I absent-mindedly asked her about the random guy who showed up to Christmas dressed as Santa that one year. It was a scary story to be told, especially how excited I was to see this man that I thought was a symbol for joy, when, in reality, he was an abusive drunk that was there to just cause terror in my aunt's life. Thankfully, nothing more happened, and he did just leave without doing anything else. But it still altered how I, and a lot of our family looked at Christmas. I have a bit of a story from back in the late 80s, when I was about 8 or 9 years old at the most. I was definitely at that age where things became core memories, but not old enough to fully comprehend the situation, so it had to be around that time. Unfortunately, the only other person that was involved with this situation, my dad, passed away a few years ago, so I can't ask him the exact date. But I can still tell the story about it. That year, my dad and I were on a long road trip. It was for a fishing trip that he'd wanted to take me on to teach me to camp and fish and all that. A father-son bonding experience kind of thing. We've been driving for a few hours. I was tired, he was a bit tired, and I had no idea where we were. As the night came on, we pulled into a gas station in the middle of a small town in, I think, Colorado. It was a small station with a single flickering light overhead, and it kind of felt deserted. My dad told me that he needed to go to the restroom and asked me if I needed to go. I told him no, and he then told me to stay in the car and that he would be right back. I would say that this was a different time and that this was a common thing back then, but honestly, he shouldn't have left me alone. I will acknowledge that at the same time as saying that he would have never have done it if he thought that it would have put me in danger. A few moments pass, and I'm just sitting there reading a comic book and waiting for him to come back, when the passenger door of the car opened randomly. Startled, I looked up to see a man that I had never seen before sliding into the front passenger seat. He was unkempt, had wiry hair and a completely vacant look in his eyes. I was stuck there watching this man just sit there, completely frozen in confusion. He didn't acknowledge that I was there, he didn't look back or say anything to me. He just sat there and stared eerily out the front windshield. In what felt like an eternity, but was more likely just a couple of moments, my dad came out of the gas station. It took him a second to process the scene too, and when he realized there was some random dude sitting in the car with his young son, he started immediately yelling, "Hey, what the hell are you doing? Get out of my car!" This guy did not react at all. He didn't flinch at my dad's yelling, or even seem to register that we were there with him. He just kept staring ahead, expressionless and distant. My dad saw that I was okay and that I was just as confused as he was, and he opened the passenger door to try to physically get this man out of the car. As my dad did so, the man did finally move, but not to get out. He just turned to look at my dad. He wasn't looking like he was aggressive or angry, he just looked empty. My dad kept trying to get him out of the car, eventually lowering his tone and saying, "Look, man, you gotta get out of the car. You're scaring my kid." The man then turned his gaze to me, and just stared with that same empty look. It looked like he was seriously disconnected from everything in every sense. I will never forget that stare, and how he looked. It was seriously etched into my memory for those moments that we made eye contact. My dad, realizing that the situation was not one that he could resolve by force or being angry, decided to try a different approach. He knelt down and started trying to talk to the man calmly, asking him if he was okay, if he needed an ambulance or needed help. There was no response, but he kept trying, just trying to reason with this man that he was causing a problem. After a few more minutes, the man slowly turned to look back at the windshield, gave a very subtle nod, and then turned to get out of the car. He walked away without a word, and just kept walking down the sidewalk. My dad immediately jumped into the driver's side and locked the doors. He asked if I was okay, if that man had hurt me or anything. I nodded, telling him I was fine, and then asked him what that was. He just told me that he didn't know. And we sat there for a few silent seconds before my dad started the car and we pulled out to get back on the road. We got to a hotel and checked in, and my dad tried his hardest to lighten the situation. I was kind of stuck mentally, just thinking about the man and what the hell had happened that evening. Later on, my dad actually used this to teach me an important lesson. He told me that the man was probably unwell or confused, and that some people have really hard lives, experiences that we could never imagine, and sometimes those experiences leave them lost. It was definitely a lesson in empathy, and I have always held that very close to my heart. It was scary at the time, sure, but there was so much going on that none of us knew about. Now, years later, I often think about that man. I do wonder what his story was. What series of events led him to climbing into a stranger's car on a quiet evening, and I wonder if he ever found his way back from wherever he was lost. I wish we could have done more to help him, but at the time there was nothing we really could have done. I guess my dad could have run back into the station and told them to call 911, but the man was gone by the time we started thinking logically again. Obviously, being the late 80s, we didn't have a cell phone to call them ourselves. And I think that my dad's main concern was just getting away from it, and getting me to safety. I don't fault my dad for it. I'm sure that if he could have done more, then he would have. We did have our trip, and the events were eventually pushed back for the rest of the time out. I don't think my dad ever told my mom about the situation either, and neither have I, because, well, she doesn't need to worry. And I wanted to share this story with you because I thought it would be a good one for your audience, if nothing else. Hopefully, they enjoy it. And if not, oh well. Thank you, Raven, and much love. Let me start this off by saying that it's kind of a long story to get to the point of it. So, I am sorry. I'm a 20-year-old male, and when I was 5, we moved from our trailer home deep in the forest and got a house closer to town. This would be the house that we stayed in for the next decade and more. My grandfather was a preacher, and he took his wife and children, one of those children being my mom, on a mission trip to Belize, where they would reside for the next few years to come. During that time, I've been told my grandfather had to perform an exorcism, and had dealt with many spiritually traumatic events. My mother told me that when she came back to the US, she had a necklace that her friend in Belize gave her as a departure gift. This necklace seemed to be bringing in negative happenings. She said she would see figures move out of the corner of her vision, hear footsteps in the house when no one was home, even hear voices talking in vacant rooms of the house. But she decided it was best to get rid of the necklace, so she did. And everything seemingly went back to normal. Fast forward to when I was 8 years old. I had separation anxiety very badly as a kid, upon other forms of anxiety. I always knew if my dad was awake in the living room late at night playing his Xbox, or if he was in bed, because I always would call out from my room to make sure he was there, just out of fear of him not being there. My older brother, my little brother, and I all shared a room at the time. My dad said that when they first moved into the house, he always got chills going in there, and wasn't sure why. He said there was an old chair and a vintage recorder that sat on top of it. He said that he couldn't explain why, but the room just gave him a creepy feeling. Anyways, one night both my brothers and I had already fallen asleep, and my dad had turned off his Xbox and went to bed. There was a bifold door closed across the room from my bed that I was always afraid of as a kid, thinking that there were ghosts in it or something. So, that night, as I was struggling to fall asleep, I watched that closet intently, almost fading into sleep when, out of nowhere, the open closet slammed shut by itself, as if a grown man had slammed it in a fit of rage. Now, I was terrified, and a bit shook up. Half hiding under my blanket, I stared into the closet all night. Nothing was in it. No one was playing a trick on me. There were no drafts in the room. Needless to say, I became pretty paranoid as a kid. Fast forward to when I was 16, I had developed a bad stomach issue leading me to think I may have developed Crohn's disease. Afraid and Googling symptoms all night, I started to fade asleep. I remember the last thing I could think that I was being punished for my wrongdoings. And when I fell asleep, I had a dream that I was in a 2-story house that I didn't recognize, and found myself running up the stairs, somehow knowing that my mother was in bed in one of the rooms. I ran into the room to find her, and saw her lying in the bed. She seemed sick, like she had a fever, and standing by her bed was a tall, looming thing. In the dream, I could see more details on this being, but once I woke up, all I could remember from it was a black void and a tall figure. I told it to leave my mom alone, and it turned to me and said, "My name is Baal." Baal being a real demon. I told it to F off, and then I woke up. When I woke up, the entire house had flooded during my time of sleeping and having that dream. The septic system had completely backflowed through every drain in the house, causing a rough day of work to deal with the flooding and the plumbing. And from that day forward, I've had horrible stomach issues, and I can't help but remember that night every time I get sick and throw up. I still get those feelings that it's watching me when I sleep at that house. Thank you for your time, and I love your channel, Raven. Thank you. Hi, my name is Aaron, and I've worked the overnight shift at a small out-of-the-way gas station for quite a number of years now. It pays enough for what I need, and I've made it work with my fiancée. Honestly, like most people have said, it's an uneventful job. For the most part, it's just me, the fluorescent hum coming from the ceiling, and the occasional late-night customer. Most people just coming off the later shifts, and cops that are on their routine drives. But I do have one story that was weird more than creepy, and I really don't have much of an explanation about it, other than that. It was a pretty quiet night. It was a bit chilly and cloudy out, so a pretty standard autumn night here. I hadn't seen any customers for about an hour, and none had used the restroom at all during my entire shift. Which may sound like a pointless fact, but it is important. Around 3 a.m., as per my cleaning routine, I decided to check and clean the floor and then do a quick check and clean up the restrooms. We have a buzzer system that rings throughout the store so no one can enter without buzzing the bell and waiting for someone inside to open the door. So I didn't have to worry about anyone coming in and ransacking the place, thankfully. The men's restroom went about as one would expect. It was a bit untidy, paper towels on the floor and such, but nothing too out of the ordinary. The women's restroom, however, was a mess. Like a major mess that I won't even describe. And thankfully, I did have time to clean it up, starting at the front, as you do. I got the whole room picked up in record time. And everything was fine until I went in to clean the last stall. There, in the toilet, was what looked like a baby doll. At first, I thought it was a real baby and my heart stopped, but as I got closer, I realized that it was just a doll. However, this doll was grotesquely mutilated. Its once blonde hair was matted and partially torn and cut off, leaving these ugly bald patches. The plastic skin was marked with what looked like burn marks and deep cuts. But the most disturbing part of it was the face. The eyes had been gouged out, leaving these dark and empty sockets. The mouth, which looked like it was once a cute smile, was cut into damn near a Joker-style grin. It looked like someone had taken their time to systematically deface and destroy this poor toy. I kind of stood there frozen for a few moments, trying to process what I was seeing. Who would do something like this? And how did they manage to get it in here without me noticing? I'd been one of 2 people at the store for a few hours, and then the only person for a few more, and none of the customers had come into this restroom the whole time I'd been alone. And my coworker had cleaned the restroom at 11 right before he left. While it could have been placed by him, he's not really a prank kind of person. He's a 60-year-old dude that, while polite, is also very work-oriented while he's here. After a few moments of just thinking about it, I was able to finally get myself to pull it out of the toilet. Wearing gloves, of course. And it looked even worse up close. When I pulled it out, I noticed the stomach had words written on it that were partially gone because they were saturated. But I'm pretty sure it said, "My hopes and dreams." I wrapped the doll in a trash bag, not wanting this thing to just sit in the trash can out in the open, in case this was some kind of cursed toy situation. I've seen enough horror movies to know that it could start with this thing coming to life. I then took the trash out, and the whole time I was playing the night over in my head, trying to figure out who could have put it there, and when they would have had the chance to do so. I even checked the camera footage for the back hallway, since there's usually nothing going on back there, and since there's no way to get into or out of the store, they only record when there's motion. I checked the security footage and clicked through all the recordings for the entire day to see if I could figure it out. And it was the weirdest thing. Not a single person had gone into the women's restroom during my entire shift. And going back further, there hadn't been a single customer to enter that restroom since 8:30 that morning. Doing the math, that was almost 20 hours prior to me finding the doll. There had been employees that had entered to check the restroom and see if it was clean, and to mop it, which we had to do regardless of cleanliness, but not a single customer entered the women's restroom at all. The person that had entered at 8:30 didn't look the type to leave a mutilated doll in the stall. She looked like a pretty normal older lady. So, through all of this, I have no idea how that doll got into the restroom. And I have no idea why the restroom was a disaster, as it had been cleaned and checked a few times since that last person used it. It's also not possible that they didn't just trigger the camera, as the doors are pretty much centered on the screen, and you can't get to the door without walking in front of them. So, by every measure of possibility, this doll just happened to teleport into the stall, and at the same time, it caused the restroom to become an absolute disaster. I have zero in ways of explanation for this, but I will say that it was creepy as hell. Thankfully, nothing like this has happened since, and hopefully it never does, because if it does, I might honestly quit right then and there. When I was around the age of 6, my mom started to clean our church every week to help out. During this time, we were renting a farmhouse where me and my 2 older brothers experienced quite a few paranormal events. But my parents never gave it the light of day, due to them being Christian and very conservative. One day, my mom was cleaning the church, and my brothers and I tagged along since my dad was working. While my mom cleaned, We decided to play hide and seek, since the church was empty. Eventually, I was the seeker looking for my brother, and I remember walking down a long hallway. Since the church was closed, and my mom was just cleaning the room where the sermons were held, all of the other lights were off except for the emergency lights. When I was walking in the very dim hall, for some reason, I felt the need to look up. And from that moment, I can't get the image of what I saw out of my head. There was an all-black figure around the size of a 6 or 7-year-old. The figure was crawling on the ceiling, so I was looking at its back. Only it had noticed me, so it had twisted its head all the way around to see me. The face was blurry since it was dark, but I could make out an almost cartoonish smile staring at me. And I remember the eyes being not human-like at all. The weird thing about this is, despite how creepy I remember the figure being, my 6-year-old self was not scared at all. I remember thinking to myself, how did my brother get up there? And then I felt the need to leave the hallway. When I saw its face, I didn't feel my stomach drop, nor did I feel scared or threatened. I just felt like whatever I saw wanted me to just move along. To this day, I don't have any idea what it was. My brothers called me crazy and said, there can't be any demons in a church since it's protected by God. And my parents agreed. The older I get, the more I wonder if it was just a dream that made itself into a memory. It just feels so real when I think about it, and I'm able to describe it in such great detail. I don't really remember any other times we played hide and seek, but this one sticks out. I know that children are more likely to have paranormal experiences, and my brothers also had things happen to them, but it was at the house. Why did I see something at our church? After doing some research, I found out that the church has been around since 1873, and I remember that there is a cemetery on the land as well, with the same name as the church. I'm happy to talk about some of the other things that happened in the house, but I don't remember much. Really only the things that my brothers have told me. The house was very old and in the middle of nowhere. It was an old farmhouse that someone purchased and had renovated. The barn was a no-go zone and gave us all the creeps. The cows on the land also acted very strange, and the house just had this weird vibe overall. My only paranormal experience was about 30 years ago, and it's the only real experience that I've ever had. I, along with 2 other friends, moved into an old Californian-style bungalow house, which was a 1910-era 3-bedroom house. We were all 25 years old at the time. It was located inner city and had an adjoining massive workshop/shed that used to be a mechanic shop and a petrol station, with a petrol Bowser on the footpath back in the 1920s. The monthly rent was quite cheap for the area and the size of the block, although the workshop was only used for storage now, and the owner had a fair bit of junk in it. One night, about 8 p.m., I was sitting in my bedroom at the desk, which was right next to the door, which was open, and this opened into the main hallway. At the right of my door was the main entrance to the house from the outside. Across was another bedroom, and to the left the hall split in 2 directions. One to the lounge room and the other went to the kitchen. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and also had the back door, which led to the backyard, and across that yard was the massive old mechanic's shed. Because we lived inner city, our security was OTT. The back door had 3 deadbolts and a chain latch. It was always locked as it was winter and the backyard was wet and muddy. Both of my housemates were out that night, and I was playing a game on my PC when I saw a guy walk down the hall. about 5 feet in front of me. I said, "Hey." He stopped briefly, turned his head ever so slightly. He was wearing blue jeans and a red plaid patterned shirt. He was about 20 years old, had lovely blonde shoulder-length hair. As I was playing a game, I didn't fully engage with him, but when I noticed he stopped, I then said, "How's it going?" and then returned to viewing the monitor with the game that I was playing. I thought it was a friend of one of my housemates, and I expected to see one of them walk past shortly. But no one did. This guy may have looked at me, but since I returned my gaze back to the screen, I'm not 100% sure. Then he just slowly walked down the hall and into the kitchen. I then realized that I never heard the front door open, and all of a sudden, every hair on my body sharply rose up. I said, "Hello?" and still got no response. So I then walked into the kitchen to see who this guy was, and there was no one there. He could not have come back out without me seeing him, and the back door had 3 locked deadbolts on it. I was so shocked, but curious too. I spent the next half an hour walking around the house, out into the backyard, in the shed, but I didn't see anyone. A week later, I went across the road from our house to the barber shop to get a haircut. The barber had been in business for generations. His father and his father before him ran the business. I told him the story, and he called his father in from out back of the shop. His father told me that back in the 1940s, when the mechanic shop was in full operation, a young man was working under a car which was on a hoist. It malfunctioned, and the young man was killed. Quite a few previous residents have seen this young man in the house, and they got scared and moved out, hence the cheap rent. We stayed for another 2 years, but I never saw him again. I was so disappointed. I would have loved to have seen him again and even tried to communicate with him. I've never seen anything paranormal since. As far as ghosts go, this was so believable. He had a solid form. He acknowledged me when I spoke to him by stopping and turning his head. I just wish that I had kept looking at him more, and I wish I had more encounters like that. 1 per lifetime is way too few. It's not fair, and I think I've been ripped off. This happened a few nights ago, when I was trying to fall asleep. I've been on holiday since near the end of November. In South Africa, around Christmas time is our summer holiday due to us being in the southern hemisphere. I normally stay up a lot later than anyone else in my house, playing video games or watching YouTube or whatever. This night, I was lying in bed with my phone at about 1 a.m. when I decided that it was a bit late, and that I should try to fall asleep. As I was lying down, I was manually breathing, when I noticed that the sound of breathing sounded slightly out of sync with my actual breath. I felt my heart slowly begin to race, but I tried to remain calm and brush it off. In an attempt to help myself feel better and fall asleep easily, I decided to hold my breath to see that the breathing sound stops too. So I did. Except the sound of breathing continued. The sound sounded like it was literally coming from directly underneath my bed. I also never noticed this sound suddenly appearing, meaning that if it was always there, it had been in sync with my breath until now. I began to freak out and thought that somehow someone was underneath my bed, even though I knew that if they had bad intentions, they would have done something already, since everyone else was supposedly asleep. This made me think that there wasn't anyone under my bed, but I still didn't know how the breath continued when I had stopped breathing. My right ear was blocked at the time, and my left ear was against the pillow, meaning that whatever I heard would almost definitely be heard through my left ear. Lifting my head up, I heard the noise continue. It was snoring from my dad in his bedroom. I couldn't help but notice that the snoring, while going at the same pace as the breathing, sounded absolutely nothing like it. Putting my head back on the pillow, I didn't hear the noise anymore. Just my dad snoring. What do you think? Was it really his snoring somehow being distorted to sound like normal breathing? And like it was coming from under my bed? Or was it something else? Something more sinister and evil?